There are moments in a hospital when everything you've learned, everything you've experienced, comes down to a single decision. A decision that happens in seconds, but carries the weight of a lifetime. This is the story of one of those moments. A moment when I had to choose between following orders from a surgeon and trusting what my eyes were telling me. A moment when a patient's life hung in the balance, and speaking up meant risking everything I'd worked for. What would you do if you had to make that choice? Would you obey, or would you trust yourself? This is my story, and it changed everything. My name is Teresa Blackwood, and I've been an operating room nurse for 17 years. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, where healthcare meant a tiny clinic with one doctor who treated everything from broken bones to pneumonia. I watched him work with limited resources, making impossible decisions, and I knew from the age of 12 that I wanted to be part of that world. But I didn't want to be a doctor. I wanted to be the person who stood beside them, the steady hand in the chaos, the one who saw what others missed. I moved to Boston when I was 23, fresh out of nursing school, wide-eyed and terrified. The city was overwhelming. The noise, the crowds, the sheer speed of everything. But Massachusetts General Hospital was where I wanted to be. It was one of the best teaching hospitals in the country, and I knew if I could make it there, I could make it anywhere. Those first years were brutal. I worked double shifts, slept in hospital break rooms, lived on vending machine coffee and whatever food the cafeteria was throwing out at the end of the night. I cried in supply closets more times than I can count. But I learned. I learned how to anticipate what a surgeon needed before they asked. I learned how to read vital signs like a language, how to spot the subtle changes that meant everything was about to go wrong. I learned that in the operating room, hierarchy exists for a reason, but so does experience. And I learned that sometimes the nurse sees things the surgeon doesn't, not because we're smarter, but because we're watching from a different angle. By the time I turned 40, I'd worked in every surgical specialty: cardiac, neuro, trauma, orthopedic, you name it, I'd been there. I'd seen miraculous saves and devastating losses. I'd held the hands of patients before they went under anesthesia, whispering reassurances I wasn't sure I believed. I'd watched families fall apart in waiting rooms and come back together in recovery. The operating room became my home, and the surgical team became my family. Dysfunctional, demanding, but bound together by the knowledge that we held people's lives in our hands every single day. I'd earned respect in that hospital. Surgeons requested me specifically for complicated cases. Younger nurses shadowed me to learn the ropes. I had a reputation for being calm under pressure, for never panicking, for always knowing exactly what needed to happen next. But respect in a hospital is a fragile thing. It can be built over decades and destroyed in seconds. And on that day, the day everything changed, I was about to test just how much my reputation was worth. It was a Tuesday in late September, one of those perfect autumn days in Boston when the leaves were just starting to turn, and the air had that crisp edge that made you feel alive. I'd arrived at the hospital at 5:30 in the morning, like always, brewing my own coffee in the staff lounge because the hospital coffee tasted like rust and regret. The operating room schedule was packed. 3 procedures before noon, all routine. Or so we thought. The first case was a gallbladder removal, straightforward and quick. The second was a hernia repair on a retired firefighter who spent the entire pre-op cracking jokes to hide his nervousness. By 10:15, we were ahead of schedule, and I was feeling good. The surgical team was working like a well-oiled machine. Dr. Harrison on the primary surgery, Dr. Kim assisting, Jake the anesthesiologist keeping everything stable, and me managing instruments and supplies with 2 other nurses, Michelle and Tom. Then the emergency call came through. A 47-year-old male, car accident victim, internal bleeding suspected, ETA 7 minutes. The energy in the room shifted instantly. Emergency surgeries are different. There's no time for careful preparation, no time for the usual protocols. You prepare for what you think is coming and pray you guessed right. We started setting up for an exploratory laparotomy, the standard procedure for abdominal trauma. Extra blood units were ordered, additional instruments laid out. The surgical field expanded. Dr. Gregory Ashford arrived with the patient. Ashford was a trauma surgeon with an ego the size of the hospital itself. Brilliant, yes, but arrogant in a way that made every surgery feel like a performance where he was the star and everyone else was merely supporting cast. He was in his early 50s, silver-haired, with the kind of commanding presence that made residents tremble and nurses choose their words carefully. I'd worked with him before, and I knew he didn't tolerate questions, didn't welcome input, and certainly didn't appreciate being second-guessed by nursing staff. The patient was a construction worker named David Chen, unconscious, his vital signs already unstable. His wife had been in the waiting room, 7 months pregnant, sobbing into her phone while trying to explain to someone that she didn't know if her husband would make it. I'd seen her briefly when they wheeled him in, that look of absolute terror that family members get when they realize how quickly everything can fall apart. It made what we were about to do feel even more urgent, even more critical. This wasn't just a patient. This was someone's husband, someone's father-to-be, someone's entire world. What did you think of what you've seen so far? Does this story resonate with you, or have you experienced something similar in your own life? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. Dr. Ashford made the first incision with the kind of confidence that comes from thousands of surgeries. The abdomen was opened. and immediately we could see blood. A lot of blood. The suction couldn't keep up with it. The surgical field was turning into a crimson pool faster than we could clear it. Ashford's jaw tightened. This was worse than the scans had suggested. Much worse. He started calling for instruments rapidly. Retractors, clamps, more suction. His hands moved quickly, exploring the abdominal cavity, trying to find the source. The liver looked intact. The spleen seemed fine. The stomach showed no obvious perforation, but the blood kept coming, pulsing with each heartbeat, which meant we were dealing with an arterial bleed. Somewhere in that mess of organs and tissue, an artery had been severed or torn, and every second we didn't find it meant David Chen was 1 second closer to bleeding out on our table. Jake called out the vital signs: blood pressure dropping, heart rate climbing. We were losing him. Ashford's movements became more aggressive, almost frantic. He was usually so controlled, so measured, but I could see the pressure getting to him. This was the kind of case that could go sideways fast, the kind where you do everything right and still lose the patient, the kind that ends up in mortality and morbidity conferences where every decision gets dissected and questioned. I was managing the instrument table, anticipating what Ashford would need next, keeping everything organized despite the chaos. But part of my attention was on the surgical field itself, watching the patterns of bleeding, the way blood pooled and flowed. It's something you develop after years in the ability to see beyond the immediate crisis and notice the details that don't quite fit. And something was bothering me. The blood was coming from the wrong direction. Ashford suddenly focused on the upper right quadrant of the abdomen, near the liver. He saw something, or thought he did. A tear in the hepatic artery, he announced. That would explain the massive bleeding. He ordered more retraction, more exposure. He was preparing to clamp the artery, to stop what he believed was the source of the hemorrhage. His entire focus narrowed to that one spot, that one vessel he was convinced was the culprit. Everyone in the room shifted their attention to support him, except me, because I was watching the lower abdomen, near the pelvis, where blood seemed to be welling up from beneath the small intestine. It wasn't the dramatic spurting that comes from a major arterial tear. It was more subtle, a steady upwelling that kept refilling the cavity no matter how much we suctioned. My stomach dropped. I'd seen this before, years ago, in a motorcycle accident victim. The bleeding wasn't coming from where Ashford thought it was. It was coming from somewhere deeper, somewhere he wasn't looking. And if he clamped that hepatic artery unnecessarily, we'd waste precious minutes David Chen didn't have. I want to thank you for staying with this story so far. I know it's intense, but I promise you, the best is yet to come. What happens next will show you exactly why I'll never forget this day. Time in an operating room during a crisis moves differently. Seconds stretch into eternities while entire minutes collapse into nothing. I watched Ashford position his clamp near what he believed was the bleeding source, and I felt my heart hammering in my chest. The monitors were screaming, blood pressure 70/40 and falling, heart rate 140 and climbing. David Chen's body was shutting down, prioritizing his brain and heart, abandoning everything else. We had minutes at best. Michelle was struggling to keep up with the suction. Blood kept filling the cavity faster than she could clear it. Tom was opening more units of blood, hanging them on the IV poles, doing everything we could to replace what David was losing. But transfusions can only do so much when you're pouring blood into a body that's hemorrhaging it right back out. We needed to stop the bleeding at its source, and we needed to do it now. Ashford's hands were steady despite the pressure. That's what made him a good trauma surgeon. He could function in chaos, could make life or death decisions without hesitation. But that same confidence sometimes made him blind to other possibilities. He'd decided the hepatic artery was the problem, and everything else in the room faded away. He called for a vascular clamp, prepared to occlude the vessel, ready to declare victory over the bleeding. But I kept watching that area near the pelvis. The blood was definitely coming from there. I was sure of it now. It had that darker quality that comes from venous bleeding, but it was too much for a simple vein. It had to be something major, something deep in the pelvis where the great vessels run before they branch into the legs, the iliac vessels maybe. If one of those was torn, it would explain everything. The volume of blood, the location, the way it kept welling up no matter what we did. I glanced at Jake. He was pushing medications, trying to support David's blood pressure artificially, but his face told me what we all knew. We were running out of time. Another 2 minutes of this bleeding and David's heart would stop. No amount of CPR or medications would bring him back from that kind of blood loss. This was the moment. This was when someone needed to speak up, needed to redirect Ashford's attention to where I thought the real problem was, and that someone had to be me. My mouth went dry. Challenging a surgeon during a procedure, especially someone like Ashford, wasn't just professionally risky, it was potentially career-ending. Surgeons have enormous power in hospitals. They bring in revenue, they have influence with administration, they control who gets to work in their ORs. A nurse who questions them publicly, who suggests they're wrong in front of the entire surgical team, becomes a target. I'd seen it happen to others. Good nurses who spoke up and found themselves transferred to less desirable units, passed over for promotions, gradually pushed out. But I'd also seen what happens when nobody speaks up. I'd been in surgeries where everyone knew something was wrong, but stayed quiet out of fear or deference to hierarchy, and patients paid the price. I'd stood at bedsides afterwards, watching families grieve, knowing that if someone had just said something, just questioned the plan, maybe things would have turned out differently. That guilt stays with you. It becomes part of who you are, and I'd promised myself, after the last time, that I would never stay silent again, no matter the cost. But Ashford positioned the clamp. His fingers were millimeters from closing it on the hepatic artery. Once he did that, we'd lose visibility of the actual bleeding source, and by the time he realized it wasn't working, it might be too late. I took a breath, feeling every eye in the room on their own tasks. Nobody else seeing what I was seeing. Nobody else about to speak up. "Dr. Ashford," I said. My voice came out stronger than I felt. "Before you clamp that vessel, I think we need to check the pelvis. The bleeding pattern suggests..." He cut me off instantly. "The hepatic artery is torn, Nurse Blackwood. I can see it. We're clamping it now." His voice had that edge that meant the discussion was over. The decision was made. The nurse needed to remember her place, but I couldn't stop. "Not now. Doctor, I've been watching the blood flow. It's not coming from the liver. It's welling up from the lower abdomen, near the iliac vessels. If we clamp the hepatic unnecessarily, we'll lose time we don't have." The temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees. Ashford's head snapped toward me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not just anger, but genuine fury. His face flushed red. "Don't touch him," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You'll make it worse. I know what I'm doing. I've been a surgeon for 23 years. I can see the bleeding source. You cannot. So I need you to hand me instruments and let me do my job. Is that clear?" The other nurses froze. Tom looked at the floor. Michelle kept suctioning, but wouldn't meet my eyes. Even Jake seemed to shrink behind his anesthesia machine. This was the moment where a smart nurse backs down, apologizes, falls in line. This was where you choose your career over your conviction. And for a few heartbeats, I almost did. I almost nodded, handed him the clamp, and let him do what he wanted to do. But then I looked at the monitor. Blood pressure 60/30, heart rate 160. David Chen was dying right in front of us. His wife was in the waiting room, pregnant and terrified, waiting to hear if she'd be raising their child alone. And I knew with absolute certainty, that if Ashford clamped that artery, we'd waste the last minutes David had. We'd watch him die while working on the wrong problem, and I'd have to live with that for the rest of my life. So I did something I'd never done before in 17 years of nursing. I stepped away from the instrument table, moved to the opposite side of the table, and used a retractor to gently lift the small intestine near the pelvis. "Come look at this," I said quietly. "Please, just look." The room went absolutely silent except for the monitors and the suction. Ashford stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Michelle whispered my name like a warning. Tom actually took a step back, as if he didn't want to be associated with what was happening. This was insubordination, pure and simple. This was a nurse physically interfering with a surgeon's procedure. I could see the headlines in my head. Nurse terminated for overstepping boundaries during emergency surgery. The next few seconds felt like hours. Ashford stood there, clamp in hand, his entire body radiating rage. I'd challenged him in front of his team. I'd suggested he was wrong. I'd physically moved to show him something he hadn't asked to see. Every protocol, every rule about operating room hierarchy, every unspoken understanding about how things worked. I just violated all of them. Part of me wanted to apologize, to step back, to pretend it never happened. That voice in my head was screaming at me about what I'd just done, about the consequences I'd face, about how I'd probably just destroyed my career for nothing. Because what if I was wrong? What if Ashford was right about the hepatic artery, and I was seeing shadows where there was nothing? What if my interference ended up costing David Chen his life instead of saving it? My mind flashed back to another surgery, 6 years earlier, a routine appendectomy that went wrong. The patient started bleeding unexpectedly, and the surgeon, a man named Dr. Reynolds, insisted it was from a small vessel he'd seen near the appendix. I'd noticed something else, a suspicious area near the cecum, but I'd stayed quiet. I'd handed him instruments and let him work on what he thought was the problem. The patient died on the table 30 minutes later. The autopsy showed a small perforation in the cecum that had been missed, exactly where I'd noticed the suspicious area. I'd had nightmares about that for months, about the moment I should have spoken up and didn't, about how my silence contributed to a death I might have prevented. I couldn't do that again. I wouldn't. Even if it meant Ashford reported me to administration. Even if it meant I lost my job. Even if it meant I never worked in an OR again. Some things matter more than careers. Some choices define who you are as a person, not just as a professional. And I'd rather be unemployed and able to look at myself in the mirror than keep my job by staying silent while someone died. Jake's voice cut through the tension. Pressure's 50/25. We're losing him. It was a statement of fact, but also a reminder that while we were having this confrontation, David Chen was bleeding to death. Every second of argument was a second closer to irreversible shock, to cardiac arrest, to death on the operating table. I kept the retractor in place, gently holding the intestine aside, exposing the area I was worried about. I didn't break eye contact with Ashford. I didn't back down. I didn't apologize. I just held my position and waited. The ball was in his court now. He could order me out of the OR and proceed with his plan, or he could could take 5 seconds to look at what I was showing him. 5 seconds that might save a life or cost me everything I'd worked for. Dr. Kim, the assisting surgeon who'd been quiet this whole time, leaned slightly toward the area I was exposing. "Dr. Ashford," she said carefully, "maybe we should just verify the source before we commit to clamping. It's pretty hard to see with all this blood." Her voice was diplomatic, but I could hear what she was really saying. "Let's look at what the nurse found before we do something irreversible." That seemed to break through Ashford's anger, or at least redirect it temporarily. He moved toward where I was standing, still gripping the clamp like a weapon. His jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping. He looked down at the area I'd exposed, and I held my breath. This was it. This was the moment where we'd find out if I'd just saved a life or destroyed my career for nothing. Ashford leaned over the surgical field, looking at the area near the pelvis that I'd exposed. For a moment, nothing happened. The only sounds were the monitors beeping frantically, the suction running, and everyone's breathing. Michelle adjusted the overhead light to give him better visibility. Tom moved closer with additional suction. We all watched as Ashford's eyes scanned the tissue, looking for what I'd seen. Then his entire body language changed. His shoulders dropped slightly. His grip on the clamp loosened. His face went from red anger to pale realization. Because there it was, a tear in the left common iliac vein, partially hidden beneath the sigmoid colon, bleeding steadily into the abdominal cavity. It wasn't dramatic or obvious. It was the kind of injury that's easy to miss if you're focused somewhere else, if you're convinced the problem is elsewhere. But once you saw it, once you knew where to look, it was unmistakable. "Oh God," Ashford whispered. "It was the kind of thing you're not supposed to say in an OR, the kind of admission that reveals you're not as in control as everyone needs you to be." He immediately shifted position, moving to get better access to the iliac vein. "Kim, I need better exposure here. Tom, get me a vascular clamp smaller than this one. Michelle, suction right here. Keep this area clear." His voice had changed. It was focused now, urgent, but controlled, all the anger replaced by the singular goal of stopping that bleeding. I stepped back, letting the surgical team take over, my hands shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. I'd been right. The bleeding was from the iliac vein, not the hepatic artery. If Ashford had clamped that artery, we would have wasted precious minutes working on the wrong area while David Chen bled out from a completely different source. My interference, my insubordination, my career-risking decision to speak up, it had been the right call. But I didn't feel victorious. I felt sick, because we'd lost valuable time in that confrontation. David's blood pressure was now in the 40s. His heart rate was erratic. Jake was pushing every medication he had, trying to keep David's heart beating, trying to maintain enough pressure to perfuse his brain. We'd found the problem, but we might have found it too late, all because of ego and hierarchy, and the assumption that surgeons always know best, and nurses should stay in their lane. Ashford worked quickly now, isolating the torn vein, clamping it above and below the injury, finally stopping the hemorrhage that had been killing our patient. The blood stopped welling up. The surgical field began to clear. For the first time since the surgery started, we could actually see what we were working on. Ashford sutured the tear with careful, precise stitches, repairing the damage the accident had caused. It took 12 minutes of intense focus, but he did it. The vein was intact again. The bleeding was stopped. Jake started reporting better numbers. Pressure coming up, 60/35. Heart rate stabilizing. At 120, he's responding. We're getting him back. The relief in the room was palpable. Tom actually smiled behind his mask. Michelle let out a long breath she'd been holding. Dr. Kim nodded in satisfaction. We'd done it. Against all odds, with seconds to spare, we'd found the bleeding source and saved David Chen's life. But the tension between me and Ashford was thick enough to cut with a scalpel. He hadn't looked at me since confirming the iliac vein tear, hadn't acknowledged that I'd been right, hadn't thanked me for speaking up. I didn't expect him to. Not yet, anyway. Not in front of everyone. But I could feel his anger simmering beneath the surface, barely contained by the professional necessity of finishing the surgery. And I knew that once we closed David Chen up and got him to recovery, I was going to face consequences for what I'd done. Where are you watching this from? I'd love to know where my fellow healthcare workers are tuning in, or if you're someone who's just fascinated by medical stories. Drop your location in the comments below. It always amazes me how far these stories reach. We finished the surgery in relative silence. Ashford checked for any other injuries, made sure everything else in the abdominal cavity was intact, and then began the process of closing. Layer by layer, peritoneum, fascia, subcutaneous tissue, skin. Each stitch was perfect, precise, professional. Whatever personal issues existed between us, Ashford wasn't the kind of surgeon who let that affect his work. I respected that about him, even as I dreaded what was coming next. David Chen was transferred to the ICU in critical but stable condition. His vital signs were improving. He'd need more blood transfusions, careful monitoring, and probably weeks of recovery, but he was alive. His wife would get to tell him about the baby. Their child would know their father. It was the outcome we'd fought for, the reason all of us had chosen healthcare in the first place. And yet, standing there watching them wheel him out, I felt no triumph, only exhaustion and dread. Ashford stripped off his surgical gown and gloves in sharp, angry movements. He turned to me, and for a moment, I thought he might explode right there in the OR, but he just said, in a voice cold enough to to freeze water. My office. 1 hour. Then he walked out, leaving me standing there with Michelle and Tom staring at me like I was a dead woman walking. Are you insane? Michelle hissed once Ashford was gone. You basically called him incompetent in front of everyone. You physically interfered with his surgery. Teresa, you could lose your license over this, not just your job. I wanted to argue with her, to defend myself, but she wasn't wrong. I'd broken fundamental rules. The fact that I'd been right didn't automatically protect me from professional consequences. The next hour was surreal. I went through the motions of cleaning up the OR, restocking supplies, filling out documentation, but my mind was elsewhere, running through possible scenarios. Would Ashford report me to the board of nursing? Would he demand my termination? Would he make it impossible for me to work anywhere in Boston? I'd heard stories of nurses who crossed powerful surgeons and ended up blacklisted, their careers effectively over. I thought about calling my husband, Marcus, but what would I say? Hi, honey. I might have just destroyed my career by challenging a surgeon during emergency surgery. Marcus was supportive, always had been, but even he might struggle to understand why I'd risked everything on a split-second judgment call. I thought about my kids, both in college now, both depending on my income for tuition. I thought about my mortgage, my car payment, all the financial obligations that required me to have a steady job. But mostly, I thought about David Chen, about his wife in the waiting room, about the baby they were expecting, about how close we'd come to him dying on that table. And I knew, even with all the consequences I was facing, that I'd made the right choice. I'd saved a life. Whatever price I had to pay for that, it was worth it. At exactly 1 hour after the surgery ended, I knocked on Ashford's office door. Come in, he said flatly. I opened the door to find not just Ashford, but also Sarah Winters, the hospital's chief of surgery, and Robert Martinez, the director of nursing. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just a reprimand. This was a formal meeting with administration. This was serious. This was potentially career-ending. Sit down, Nurse Blackwood, Sarah Winters said, gesturing to the chair across from Ashford's desk. Her voice was neutral, giving nothing away. I sat, my back straight, hands folded in my lap, trying to project a confidence I absolutely did not feel. The three of them looked at me like a tribunal, and I felt like I was on trial. Ashford spoke first. He'd had an hour to compose himself, and his voice was controlled now, but I could still hear the anger underneath. I've just spent the last hour explaining to Dr. Winters and Director Martinez what happened in the OR today. How you directly contradicted my assessment during a critical surgery. How you physically interfered with my procedure. How you, a nurse, suggested that I, a surgeon with over 2 decades of experience, was wrong about the source of a patient's bleeding. His emphasis on the word nurse made it clear exactly how he viewed the hierarchy and where he thought I belonged in it. Sarah Winters leaned forward. I've heard Dr. Ashford's version of events. Now I'd like to hear yours, Teresa. Why did you feel it was necessary to challenge the lead surgeon during an emergency procedure? I took a breath and told them everything. What I'd observed about the bleeding pattern, my concern that we were focused on the wrong area, my certainty that the iliac vessels were the actual source. I explained my decision to speak up, despite knowing the professional risks. I didn't apologize, didn't try to minimize what I'd done. I owned it completely. Robert Martinez, my own nursing director, looked troubled. Teresa, you understand that what you did violated established protocols? That the chain of command exists for patient safety? That nurses who question surgeons during procedures create dangerous confusion? I nodded. I do understand that, Robert, but I also understand that patient safety means speaking up when you see something that could cost someone their life. Protocols exist to help us, not to prevent us from thinking critically. Ashford's face reddened again. She wasn't thinking critically. She was being insubordinate. I'd identified the bleeding source. I was preparing to address it. She had no right to question my judgment, to interfere with my procedure, to undermine my authority in front of my surgical team. His voice was rising, the professional veneer cracking. This kind of behavior is exactly why we have hierarchies in the first place, but you were wrong, I said quietly. The words hung in the air like a grenade. The hepatic artery wasn't torn. The bleeding was from the iliac vein. If we'd clamped the hepatic unnecessarily, we would have wasted time we didn't have. David Chen would be dead right now. You know that's true. The silence that followed was deafening. Ashford stared at me with something between fury and grudging acknowledgement. Sarah Winters looked between us, clearly weighing the situation. Robert Martinez rubbed his temples like he had a massive headache. Nobody spoke for what felt like minutes. Finally, Sarah Winters broke the silence. Dr. Ashford, your surgical notes confirm that the primary bleeding source was indeed the left common iliac vein, correct? Ashford nodded stiffly. And the hepatic artery, which you initially believed was torn, was actually intact? Another stiff nod. So Nurse Blackwood's assessment was accurate? A long pause then. Yes. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled under her chin. Here's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing a trauma surgery that went sideways fast. I'm seeing a surgeon under enormous pressure making a judgment call about the bleeding source. I'm seeing a nurse with 17 years of OR experience who believed that judgment call was wrong and chose to speak up despite the professional risks. And I'm seeing a patient who survived because someone had the courage to question the plan. She looked directly at me. Teresa, what you did violated protocols. You challenged the lead surgeon's authority. You created conflict in the middle of a critical procedure. By the book, that's grounds for disciplinary action. But she turned to Ashford. You were wrong about the bleeding source. If Nurse Blackwood hadn't spoken up, we'd be having a very different conversation right now, one involving a patient death and a morbidity review. So the question becomes, do we punish the nurse who saved a patient's life by violating protocol, or do we acknowledge that maybe our protocols need to account for situations like this? And the meeting ended with an uncomfortable compromise. I received a written reprimand for insubordination and failure to follow proper chain of command procedures. It would stay in my personnel file for 2 years, but I kept my job, kept my OR privileges, and was not reported to the Board of Nursing. Ashford was required to attend a workshop on collaborative communication in surgical teams, and the hospital convened a task force to review and potentially revise protocols around nursing input during surgical procedures. Was it fair? Probably not. I'd saved a man's life and I got written up for it, but I also understood the complexity of the situation. Hospitals need structure and hierarchy. You can't have every nurse second-guessing every surgeon's decision. That would create chaos and genuinely endanger patients. But you also can't have a culture where nurses are afraid to speak up when they see something wrong. Finding the balance between those two realities is harder than it sounds. David Chen spent 3 weeks in the ICU, another 2 on the surgical floor, and then went home to his wife and newborn daughter. He sent me a card when he was discharged. He'd heard from his wife that there had been complications during his surgery, that a nurse had spotted something that saved his life. He thanked me for being there, for paying attention, for caring enough to speak up. That card is framed on my wall at home, and on bad days, I look at it and remember why I became a nurse in the first place. My relationship with Ashford never fully recovered. We worked together occasionally after that. He still requested experienced nurses for complicated cases, and I was one of the best. But there was always tension between us. He never explicitly thanked me for what I'd done, though about 6 months later, during a particularly difficult trauma case, I saw him glance at me before making a major decision, silently asking for my input. I nodded my agreement, and he proceeded. It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. Sometimes that's the best you can hope for. The protocols did change, though. The task force implemented a new policy allowing any OR team member to call a formal timeout if they had serious concerns about patient safety during a procedure. It had to be used judiciously. You couldn't stop a surgery for trivial issues, but it gave nurses and other staff a mechanism to raise concerns without being seen as insubordinate. Several other hospitals in Boston adopted similar policies. I like to think that David Chen's case helped make surgery safer for patients across the city. I'm still at Mass General, still working in the OR, still loving what I do despite the stress and the long hours and the impossible decisions. I've trained dozens of younger nurses over the years, and I always tell them the same thing. Trust your experience, trust your eyes, trust your gut, and when something feels wrong, speak up, even when it's hard, even when it's scary, even when you might face consequences. Because at the end of the day, we're here for the patients. Everything else is secondary. Looking back on that day, I don't regret what I did. I regret that it had to be so confrontational, that the hierarchy made it so difficult to raise concerns, that it took me challenging a surgeon publicly to get him to look at what I was seeing. But I don't regret speaking up. I don't regret trusting my judgment, and I don't regret the price I paid for doing what I knew was right. David Chen's daughter is 4 years old now. His wife sends me photos occasionally, birthday parties, first day of preschool, family vacations. Every time I see those pictures, I remember that day in the OR, remember the choice I had to make, remember how close we came to this little girl never knowing her father. And I know beyond any doubt that whatever consequences I faced, it was worth it. So now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between following the rules and doing what you believed was right? Have you ever had to speak up when everyone else was silent? What would you do if you were in my shoes that day? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely want to know your perspective on this. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about courage and choices and what it means to stand up for what you believe in, please subscribe to this channel. There are so many more stories like this one. Real experiences from real nurses dealing with impossible situations, making split-second decisions that change lives forever. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. And speaking of the next one, there's another incredible story waiting for you in the recommended video. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.